The study and the comparison of violence and conflict in Nairobi and Santiago are revealing some very interesting findings, and also in terms of responses. What we did not expect, but which comes out, is that there are quite a number of similarities and also differences. In Nairobi, we focused a lot more on political violence, and in Santiago, the focus was domestic. But what is interesting is that in both instances, it is quite clear what the role of political power and the role of governance in terms of dealing with violence. What I find very fascinating is about violence and space, because these are different cities, but also similar cities. I mean, Santiago is a middle to high income city. Nairobi has a huge number of poor populations. But what is interesting is that there is clearly a spatial dimension to violence. In Nairobi, it is about contestation of space. It's about lack of space. And there's a lot of conflicts generated around space. The other issue in Nairobi is the link between space and other socioeconomic resources, because space is what people use for the construction of their houses and so on. So you find there's a lot of intense fights around that. And what you're finding in Santiago is the other way around, that the huge privatization and commodification results in either neglect of space or a situation where the public realm almost disappears. And what I found very fascinating is that now violence starts happening in other invisible spaces, the private spaces. So it is quite clear that there's a spatial dimension to conflict and violence. It just manifests itself differently in different cities. Listening to people here in Santiago and listening to people in Nairobi also demonstrates there's a big issue around social fragmentation. And sometimes, in our case, we're finding this fragmentation manifesting itself around other social issues like ethnicity, or issues of political parties or economic. And here in Santiago, it's very, very clear that fragmentation is actually around economic classes. And this now ends up creating a situation where conflict and violence is intensified, either directly through perceptions, either directly through actual crimes and in low-income areas, or perceptions of violence in other areas. So what is very interesting in all this is that a fragmented society by its nature is violent. In fact, this is what seems to be coming through. And the conflict and violence is present in all the classes. This is what the Santiago story is actually telling us. And in the Kenyan story, is the other way around, because the same is more or less a similar social class, but a lot of differentiation socially. And again, that produces this fascinating, conflict, intensity of conflict and violence. The other point I want to make, which I think is very, very interesting, is that for us, both in Santiago and here, one issue that seems to be coming out clearly is that both the design of social policy and the content of social policy is totally inadequate to deal with this issue of violence. Inadequate first in terms of the narrow focus on crime in both cities, but also inadequate in terms of process. That policy tends to be top down, and policy making needs to create spaces where people's voices can actually be heard, and where people's voices can actually inform policy. And yes, the last point I want to make around this is that actually this is the heart of the issue. It's about power in policy making. Thank you.